My name is Dr. Wanjiru Kamau Rutenberg, and I wear two hats. I'm an executive in residence at Schmidt Futures, which is a philanthropic entity, and I'm also the founder and CEO of Be Well, which is Black Women in Executive Leadership. I also sit on a number of boards in the climate and agriculture space, so I keep myself busy paying attention to issues really at the intersection of gender, climate, and food systems. I think we are at a really good moment in human history where there's broad recognition that climate change is an important issue, an issue that needs addressing, one that we can't continue to ignore. For the African continent, I think we're also getting to a really good place of shifting the narrative away from climate change being the end of the development that we've been seeing in terms of lifting our people out of poverty and shifting into a narrative of understanding that if we as a continent can successfully address a climate crisis, we then are facing a tremendous opportunity to continue lifting our people out of poverty and growing our economies. And so for the African continent, the climate conversation represents a tremendous opportunity to align financing, policy, and leadership around addressing the climate crisis in a way that spurs economic growth and development and lifting our people out of poverty and into more dignified lives. It is indeed true that the climate crisis is not gender neutral. We know that women and girls, by virtue of being forced to the margins of society, end up bearing a greater burden in terms of the climate crisis. And we also, I think, can come to agreement that gender equality and addressing the climate crisis are absolutely interlinked. Women and girls are important, and especially when we bring in a conversation and an understanding of food systems, women and girls are important to agricultural and food systems on the continent, and food systems are absolutely important to women and girls' livelihoods. A majority of the continent's women get the economic livelihood from the agriculture sector, from food systems. And so to the extent that climate change continues to make it difficult for them to earn a livelihood, then addressing the climate crisis is addressing gender equality. And we also know that we need women and girls' actions in building more equitable systems. And so they are the human talent that is going to drive solutions to the climate crisis. Women and girls are important to food systems, and food systems are important to women and girls. And to the extent that climate change sits in the middle of those two relationships, we cannot talk about one without the other two. So food systems and climate change are absolutely interlinked. The ways we produce food and process food and consume food is deeply impacted by climate change. Changing weather patterns are affecting our ability to produce, process, and store food. Changing weather patterns are also impacting the pests and diseases that affect and harm food in farm and also post-harvest. Right square in the middle of that relationship are gender dynamics. We know that a vast majority of Africa's women get their economic livelihood from the agriculture sector and from food systems more broadly, from producing, processing, from farm to fork, really. A majority of the continent's women are engaged economically in food systems. So to the extent that climate change then impacts food systems, it has a disproportionate impact on the continent's women and their livelihood. Conversely, if we are to agree that the climate crisis also represents a tremendous opportunity for this continent to innovate and leapfrog technologically, then we're going to need human capital and human talent driving those innovations. And that is where those people, that talent, that human capital that is engaged in food systems, that tends to be a majority women, are going to be absolutely essential in driving the technological transformation that the continent needs to adapt to a changing climate. And so you really cannot speak about food systems without talking about climate change or without talking about gender, and especially women's livelihoods. You really cannot speak of any of those three without talking about the other two dynamics. That is why I'm just so passionate about the intersection of food systems, climate change, and gender equality. It's really important to recognize that the people who will actually implement the solutions that we're talking about are largely going to be the women who are engaged in food systems. And so to that extent, gender equality, ensuring that Africa's female farmers have equal access to farm inputs, to technology, and innovation is going to be an important part of driving Africa's climate adaptation strategy. It's really important to keep the momentum that we currently have going. And one of the best ways to keep up this momentum is to engage a broad swath of stakeholders. I think the work ahead of having a more integrated lens between gender, what's happening with gender dynamics, with climate change, and with the need to engage Africa's youth, driving that momentum is going to require the engagement of policymakers, the engagement of private sector, the engagement of civil society, continued engagement of civil society, and really thinking creatively about how we finance this work. And that means engagement by philanthropy, which can de-risk innovative solutions, but then also engagement, financial engagement and financing by governments, which can really scale and sustain those solutions that are proven to work. And so from my perspective, engaging a broad swath of stakeholders is absolutely critical to maintaining momentum. Ultimately, I believe government has the biggest role to play in driving gender equality. And the biggest tool they have is policy. Yes, there's a lot of work to do in terms of changing hearts and minds, but until we have policies, laws, legislation that make it illegal to discriminate, where governments say on behalf of countries, we as a country are not going to leave half of the human capital that we've been blessed with outside as we achieve our development mandate, until countries decide to do that. And the way to do that is policy and legislation. We really won't have gender equality. This is not favors that are needed. This is countries recognizing that to meet the development imperative, to meet the climate adaptation imperative, to meet Africa's imperative to feed itself, we cannot afford to keep wasting half of the human capital that we're blessed with. And that means we cannot afford to keep relegating women to the margins. There's a tremendous amount of talent we've been wasting as a continent, and we really need to turn that around. In addition to policy and driving legislation that mandates equality and advances the equality agenda, I think before governments can do that, it's really about being serious about the issue and understanding that this isn't often the issue of gender equality is framed as a battle between men and women. It really isn't. It is just so much an imperative of not leaving talent on the table, not leaving human resources, human capital that we've been blessed with off to the margins. And so governments getting serious about making use of all the resources that we have, be they financial, natural, or human resources, is going to be absolutely critical if Africa is to innovate our way out of this climate crisis. One of my favorite books, and it's a bit of a strange one, but one of my favorite books is The Little Prince. And what I love about that book is that imperative to work our little patch of earth, to dig and cultivate and nurture what is within our sphere of responsibility and influence. And so those of us not in policymaking spaces are in other spaces. We have other responsibilities. We have other forms of power. And so making sure that we are driving an equality agenda across where we have power and influence, making sure that we're paying attention to issues of climate, where we have power and influence, becomes really important. If each of us worked with an equality agenda, worked our little patch of earth with an equality agenda, we would have a far more equal world than we do today. I think it's going to be really important for all of us across the continent to appreciate that climate change is an African issue. Yes, it's true. We as Africans have not contributed the greenhouse gases to the extent that our neighbors to the north have. That said, as it says, Bob Marley reminded us, when it rains, it doesn't rain on one man's house. And we here on the continent are getting rained on, literally, quite heavily. Yes, we didn't cause it, but we have to deal with it. And it is our imperative, both for this generation and for future generations, to step up to the challenge and make sure that our children's children will have a continent to inherit, will have a rich, thriving, diverse, biologically viable, ecologically viable continent to inherit. That is my message to my fellow Africans.